and welcome back to all the viewers for the sixth and final talk by Professor Fred Gregory. Climatologists have been warning us for at least 2 decades that worldwide we need to drastically reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere. About 2/3 of that problem comes from the burning of fossil fuels. And in advanced countries, much of that fuel is used to produce electricity. Worldwide, about 10% of the electricity is produced by nuclear reactors, which of course has no greenhouse gases associated with it. In the US, that figure is 20%. In France, it's 70%. 70% of their electrical power is produced by nuclear reactors. A large part of the problem about increasing the use of nuclear power is associated with the real and the perceived dangers of operating those nuclear reactors. So that's the topic that Professor Gregory is going to explore with us today. Take charge, Bill.
All right, thank you very much, John. Now let me see if I can get things going here. All right, are we good? Does everybody see that? All right, good to check. Okay, so yes, today we're going to be talking about the dilemma, challenge, weighing nuclear accidents against the demand for energy. There were, right after 1945 and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, there were non-military expectations from the discovery of nuclear fission. And the original hope was we would be able to capture atoms for peace. That was the title of a lecture or a speech that Eisenhower gave to the UN in December of 1953. Maybe some of you remember that program, although I was too young to have wondered about it. But Eisenhower had more than one motive in giving that speech. Obviously, it was to promote the development of the peaceful use of nuclear energy, but it was also part of a new transparency that the Eisenhower administration adopted to alleviate fears. Now, the fears were coming from rumors of nuclear tests, obviously from the explosions of the atomic bombs. But this was a media campaign they undertook, and they called it Operation Candor. And they were also Eisenhower was also addressing fears that European allies had about our pivoting away from the use of conventional weapons and to nuclear weapons and starting a war with Russia in Europe. So they were worried about our use of nuclear weapons on their soil, understandably. Nuclear power research was already underway when Eisenhower gave that speech. The first experimental reactor, or an early one, was very modest in what it was producing, but it wasn't long before it was using nuclear energy, or the Navy vessels were, and homes would be able to benefit from the production of electricity from nuclear power in 1955. I just want to give you a brief idea of how a reactor worked. First, basically, very basically, a reactor is a controlled fission, whereas a bomb is an uncontrolled fission, right? So what happens in this, if I can get my cursor here going, this is the water that cools. This is where the boiler, not the boiler, this is where the atomic reactions take place in here. These are control rods that I think they're usually made of some form of carbon, graphite or something, which if you insert them down into the main chamber here will reduce the reaction because they will absorb neutrons. So it slows down the reaction. When you take them out, then the reaction can go at a higher speed. And if you then produce this, if you have this reaction going on, it generates an amazing amount of heat, which heats this water, which then goes over here And somewhere along the line that's not shown here is a turbine that would get turned, and that turbine then is going to operate a generator, which is going to generate electricity. So it's the heat that you're producing by the atomic reaction that turns a turbine, and that generates electricity. That's basically the idea. And then you have different, this is where steam is released. Sometimes you go by a big nuclear reactor tower, you see the steam being released. So that's just the idea. But anxiety did not abate in the 1950s. In spite of Eisenhower's speech, people knew rumors about H-bomb tests in the 50s, and there were protests against nuclear power that were already going on. Now, what helped to diminish that was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. That tended to calm fears a little bit. There's a book that came out in 1988, and it was reprinted with images in 2012, called Nuclear Fear by a colleague of mine. He's a historian of science. He was the director of the American Institute of Physics, called Nuclear Fear, Spencer Wirt. And he argues in that book several things. I'm going to be talking about it at different points today. First of all, that the public was not able to detach images of nuclear bombs from those of nuclear energy. So that made the challenge greater to be able to deal with nuclear energy. So the anti-nuclear movement remained alive throughout the 60s and 70s, even though no major accidents had occurred. Now, that's not exactly true. There had, in fact, been accidents. Americans were not aware of several of them that happened in the former Soviet Union. In 1957, in Mayak in Siberia, the cooling system for a tank storing thousands of tons of dissolved nuclear waste resulted in a chemical explosion. It wasn't a nuclear explosion. Usually these explosions happen for, a steam or chemical or some other reason that then releases radioactive material. And it was what happened as a result of this was the fission products drifted off site, and they contaminated a region. There was a river nearby, and a lot of it went down the river and ended up really affecting a lot of people with radiation-induced cancer, because it wasn't really controlled at all. People didn't know what they were doing. Basically, this was early stages here. And they had a history of nuclear accidents at this site for quite some time. Now, the Soviets concealed that. So we didn't know about it in the West until 1990 or 80, somewhere in there. No, it was later than 80, but it was late. So we didn't know at the time. So it really didn't have any impact on our anti-nuclear movement. And of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis carried in 62 and 62, and that did nothing to abate fears of things nuclear at all. So while public opposition had withered somewhat in the aftermath of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which called for no tests underwater or no tests in the atmosphere or no tests in space, it did not ban tests underground, but it did wither. But then what happened was the accident at 3 Mile Island. And that did affect our national attitude here, as you can imagine. Now, what's amazing to think about is that 10 days before this accident, Jane Fonda's new movie had come out. And that was the China Syndrome. And maybe later, if I can, I'll try, but I have the trailer for it here, but I don't want to try that because it's not the easiest thing in the world. So here's 3 Mile Island now, and this is a little more detailed operating or outline of the 3 Mile Island. So there was an initial problem with the secondary pump here, and that means that the water going around here if that shuts down, then the coolant isn't going to be effective in cooling the chamber here, right? Where's my cursor? There it is. All right, and so what that's going to do is mean that the heat is going to go up and it's not going to be cooled. So it's going to increase pressure everywhere. And that has a valve that's supposed to relieve the pressure when that happens. And so, but if you leave the valve open, you're going to be draining the water through steam. It's just going to be draining coolant. Well, there was a dial. They people at 3 Mile Island had tried to close that valve at the appropriate time. But the dials weren't working and they couldn't find them. Whatever it was, they were not aware that the valve remained open when they thought it had closed, and the coolant continued to drain away. And that's a big problem. So that means the core gets uncovered and they begin to melt. So we did have a partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island. And then hydrogen gas is released, and that later would be detected, and it was fearing of a hydrogen explosion. That was a big concern for a number of days before they got that under control. Well, Carter was president. He went to 3 Mile Island right after that, and he was a nuclear engineer, so he kind of knew what he was doing there. And he went to help alleviate fears of the American public. So the lessons are here that we can have unforeseen problems that can arise with equipment malfunction and operator error. The hydrogen bubble, nobody had anticipated that, but that was something they learned about. There was obviously a miscommunication among some of the state and federal agencies, which is bound to occur if it's never been run before. It's like somebody once said about the nuclear possibility of thermonuclear war. If we had a thermonuclear war, there would be a massive exchange of nuclear weapons, but they probably wouldn't go where they were supposed to, because nobody's ever run this experiment of actually doing that, right? And so when something like this happens, you can't have run the experiment. Now they do try to do scenarios in which they anticipate all the possible problems, but you can't imagine things you can't imagine. And so that's when you learn them. And the media didn't really help the matter, because you can imagine, given that the media loves to sell papers or whatever, that the sensationalization is too tempting here. And so you would go with rumors to some extent, whatever. Well, what was the effect? What were the effects of 3 Mile Island? Actually, they were not very severe. In spite of the partial meltdown, they did get it under control, obviously. Those living within 10 miles got radiation that amounted to about 1 chest X-ray. There was no detectable health effects in a 20-year tracking study that was conducted. There were people that were making claims, of course, but nobody was ever able to prove that they had contracted cancer or anything like that, because the release of radioactive material had been contained for the great, most of it was contained in the containment building, et cetera. There's a lot of water that had been lost with radioactivity in it, but it was on the floors of the containment building. And so that part of the system worked the way it was supposed to. But that didn't mean that the public was going to forget all this. In another 1983 movie, so this is 4 years after 3 Mile Island, and I don't know if you've ever seen I watched it. I was telling a couple people before the class began about, I watched both that movie, The China Syndrome, which was with Jane Fonda and Jack Lemmon and Michael Douglas. And then 4 years after 3 Mile Island, there was another movie which called Silkwood, Meryl Streep and Cher. And Cher's first actually dramatic role. I mean, she had usually been used as a singer, but in this movie, she has a dramatic role. And Kirk Russell is the male. And this is a story that's a lot like Radium Girls. In many senses, both these movies were stories like Radium Girls. They were trying to talk about the responsibility of corporate people who are dealing with radioactive materials that are associated with some corporation, all right, and the mishandling and whatever. So, and that's what this one did as well. Meryl Streep. In both of them, there's a similar pattern in both of them. Now, this one, Silkwood, was based on an actual person, Karen Silkwood, and she worked I think it was in an Oklahoma Kerr-McGee facility, and that was plutonium, and she got exposed to radiation, and so she became very active as a union person, whistleblower, et cetera, and that caused all kinds of problems. And at the end of the movie, it shows her being followed by somebody at night in a car. And then the next morning, that car had an accident. Well, there was an accident. She was killed, but nobody has been able to establish any blame for that accident. You know, nobody, I mean, it looks highly suspicious, and the movie makes a great deal of that. The similar kinds of things happen in the other movie. There is a corporation which is trying to silence people, and so that has a pattern that's been utilized by Hollywood. Well, we don't get any let up here, because next after that movie, 1986, you have the second major accident at Chernobyl, which is a different kind. This is a Russian designed reactor. And the guy who was the director of it ran a test or an experiment, even though the reactor was at just 7% of power, which he wasn't supposed to have done, but they figured this was all going to be okay. And in this test, they had to shut down the power regulating system and the emergency safety systems. And then they take the control rods from the core. Well, this is not going to go well. It's a big mistake. And the chain reaction in the core produces a large fireball, and several explosions blew off the steel and concrete lid of the reactor. So now everything that's gone wrong in the reactor is exposed to the atmosphere. And there's a debate for years and years. It was assumed that this explosion that blew the lid off was steam generated. And I read in preparation here that some people are now arguing that it was actually a nuclear explosion. So I don't know where that debate stands, but at any rate, well, the graphite core reactor released a large amount of radioactive material into the atmosphere. It was carried great distances by air currents. And there was also a partial meltdown of the core that occurred here. So the director there was sentenced to 10 years in prison, although many point out there were major design flaws in the Chernobyl reactor, regulations that were bypassed, even its own, but also the design. Now, if we're trying to assess that damage, it's a little more difficult, because everybody knows or has agreed that the direct deaths attributed to the explosions, et cetera, were 31. But how do you calculate the number of deaths from the effects of radiation exposure? Well, that varies a lot. World Health Organization puts the figure at 4,000 for Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Now, we're assuming that people contracted cancer as a result of exposure to radiation in the atmosphere. This is where the exposure level was highest here. And if you go to wider regions, WHO estimates 9,000, but there are other people that want to make it a whole lot more. So that's going to be one of those things. This is where the radiation went, by and large, because of air currents. And I remember when this happened, wondering whether it would ever reach the United States. Remember, there was a novel that came out in East Germany called Unfall, which is accident. And it talked about having to wash your lettuce and all this kind of thing. Well, that was the second of our major accidents. The third one is, of course, more recent, Fukushima. And this occurred 10 years ago, this coming March 11th. So we're coming up on a marking of that event. Doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was. So there was an earthquake out under the ocean floor, and that caused, it was sensed as it was intended to be sensed if that happened. And so the reactors immediately shut down. But what happened was there were some problems in the electrical grid supply. And if the electricity fails, then the pumps fail and you got a problem. Like we had in the last time, you're going to start heating things up. Well, you have a backup for that. And the emergency diesel generators needed to keep the pumps going to keep the reactor cool, automatically started. What nobody did think of was the tsunami that resulted. And the tsunami was 46 foot high, and it drove ocean water over the plant seawall that was outside there, and it flooded the reactors, and that shut down the emergency generator. So you're back to your problem of the core heating up. And the resultant loss of reactor core cooling led to the 3 nuclear meltdowns of 3 individual reactors, and hydrogen explosions, and again, the release of radioactive contamination. So in the days after the accident, the radiation released to the atmosphere forced the government to declare an ever larger evacuation zone. ultimately, it evacuated a zone of around 20 kilometers around. So what was that impact? Well, the health impact there, the World Health Organization projected no increase in miscarriages, stillbirths, or physical or mental disorders in babies born after the incident. There's an estimate that the cleanup is going to take a long time to both decontaminate the affected areas and decommission the plant. The impact of Fukushima on the perception of nuclear power, obviously, is going to be not good. The disaster negatively affected attitudes in Japan, as you can imagine. Political and energy experts described the impact as nothing short of a nationwide loss of faith, not only in the once vaunted nuclear technology, but also in the government, which they blame for allowing this accident to happen. Well, nuclear power presents us with some real dilemmas here. And as John mentioned earlier, nuclear here is about 10% worldwide, and this is the rest of them, all right? So you can see that coal is great. Now, in our country, this figure is 20. In France, it used to be 79, but I guess they've decreased that to about 70%, John mentioned. So they're highly dependent on nuclear energy. And here's gas and oil and wind. Germany's doing a lot with wind. If you go to Germany these days, you're bound to see those turbines turning. Solar is here, biomass, etc., and other thermonuclear. What do I want to say? Thermal, from the heat inside the earth. So these alternative supplies are not really great. And if you're phasing out coal, which we would love to do because it's not the most clean, and it does contribute to climate change, whereas nuclear doesn't, you can see that we have a problem here because we depend on energy. The country is not going to decrease its need for more and more and more energy from year to year. We're more and more dependent on digital things, electricity, for virtually everything we do. In that storm the other night, our electricity went out for a little bit, and all of a sudden you realize there's no computer. You realize exactly how dependent you are on electricity. So that's a problem. As of October last fall, there were 56 commercially operating nuclear power plants with 94 nuclear power reactors. So some of the plants have more than one reactor on site. But in spite of being dependent on nuclear power, the public today remains generally wary of it. And you know the reasons. You can understand the reasons. We haven't built any plants in the last 30 years. There are a couple of plants that are about to come online up in Georgia. There's a couple. But all these countries here, back in 2016, they no longer use it. They remain opposed. And I know that Angela Merkel was opposed to it and wanted to go away from nuclear power. But there have been some strides made in nuclear technology and safety. We've learned a great deal from these accidents. It's like anything. You learn things, and so you do it better the next time around. The next generation small reactors are very impressive in their performance and in their safety, so they're not as large, for one thing. Now, I'm going to show you a slide in a minute, but I want to tell you where it came from. It's going to compare immediate fatalities in some of the other energy industries to show you that nuclear fares pretty well. Now, the one thing that is not going to be there, so I want to be completely honest with you in reading this, don't forget that we're not talking about long-term cancer deaths, for example, which are really hard to estimate. Where are these coming from? The Organization of Economic Cooperation Development, OECD. It is 32 democracies of the world, and this is who's in it. So you can see virtually, Russia's not there. So that's one of the reasons why some of these figures are not as high as you might think. So there are the figures. So if you look at coal and the number of fatalities, and then compare it with these, now the reason I say Russia's not there, because these fatalities would definitely be there if we had immediate fatalities. These are immediate fatalities, again, from the actual accident itself, not from long-term radiation exposure. So this is only worth so much, but it does tell you, it does make you think of where nuclear stacks at some degree, at any rate. So the question is, why do we fear nuclear power so much? Well, Spencer Weir, the historian I mentioned earlier, argues that nuclear politics is laden with emotion because it links the prospects of abundant energy to some of humanity's most deep-seated myths about utopia and power, violation, and hell. In this particular picture, you can see this light up at the top could be a blessing from heaven, and it could be a nuclear explosion. I mean, we've mixed those together with a nuclear scenario. And they are deep-seated primal feelings, these myths that we have, at least in the West, about hell, etc. And they're easily called forth by nuclear prospects. Now, what Weir wants to argue is that we implicitly assume that we're actually living in a world of our primordial fantasies and nightmares. And that complicates our abilities to have a sensible, pragmatic nuclear policy debate. It gets really emotional quickly. And he's suggesting that these deep-seated primal feelings are at work, they're present, and we should just be aware of that. So we can try to deal with this question of nuclear energy in some kind of reasonable way. If you look at the paradox in US nuclear development since 1945, we've expanded our weapons arsenal geometrically, but nuclear energy plants have grown merely arithmetically. So Americans have generally embraced the country's nuclear arsenal as much more essential than they do the need for energy supply. How did we stop worrying about and love the bomb, to quote Stanley Kubrick and Dr. Strangelove, but continue to balk at nuclear power? Well, you're going to tell me that in the discussion. My question is, and this is where we're going to end here. So we end where we started, where we began, asking if Zeus was right or wrong to punish Prometheus for stealing fire and giving it to the humans, to the mortals, which he said they will not be able to handle this. And so that's the question we're still asking. And if we do handle it, how can we handle it? So I'll stop there and we'll come back and turn it over to Lance. And I'm sure there's a lot of comments. I'm no expert on the nuclear power industry, but I'll answer any question that I can. However, I have a feeling there's a number of you among us that will also have a lot of information and knowledge about this issue. So I'm going to turn it over to Lance.
And I'm going to throw it right over to Mr. John Axe to begin with, and then if you have any comments you want to say or any questions, again, feel free to use the raise the hand button. If you raise it physically, it's sometimes hard for me to see that. Also, feel free to send in the chat. I'm frequently checking the chat function, and I hop between raised hands and that. And yes, just please stay muted. That way it doesn't become everyone talking all at once. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lance. I'm going to use my position as a moderator to start off by telling you a little story. I'm not an entirely unbiased observer of this because I worked at a place called Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island for nearly 30 years. And much of that time was spent sitting near maybe 20 feet away from the core of a 60 megawatt nuclear reactor. And I was doing that because I was performing experiments that used the neutrons that it produced. I knew the folks that were responsible for the operation of that reactor, and I felt safer there than I did sometimes driving to and from work on a snow-filled highway. I felt glad that I could get to work and sit near that nuclear reactor. But after 50 years of safe operation, this reactor was shut down. in the mid 1980s because of a cascading series of events that started from a tiny leak of tritium. Tritium is a radioactive form of hydrogen. It has a 12-year half-life. And there was a tiny leak of tritium from the water that was used to hold the spent nuclear fuel elements. It posed no health risk. Our health physicists estimated that if we drank the water from the pool as close as we could get to it, a glass of that water would contain as much health problems as eating a banana. You do all know that banana has radioactive potassium in it, right? So that's about that. So that was the I'm not excusing that or not finding that leak, which had been going on for some time, but it never leaked offsite. And even at its highest, it was no health risk beyond eating a banana. But it attracted a lot of vocal anti-nuclear activists who had just managed to close down a $6 billion Shoreham nuclear power plant, which was right down the road from us. That plant was completed, but it never operated. $6 billion. The protesters were very pleased when that nuclear power plant was replaced by a wind turbine facility that produced 1/30,000th of the amount of electricity that nuclear power plant did. So even after 30 years, my memory of those events, as I say, don't make me give me an unbiased assessment of the interactions between the anti-nuclear and pro-nuclear power people. So, I'm going to turn that back. I'm going to turn that back to you, Lance. You want to get some people?
So I have a list of when the hands are raised and when comments are sent in. So if it feels like I haven't gotten around to you yet, I promise if the hand is raised or if the comment sent, I have you in order. I'm just going through when they've appeared, but have no fear, I will get to you. So to begin, we are going to start with Jack, who has their hand raised.
Yes, is the volume okay?
Perfect.
Okay, back to your chart, Fred. You had coal listed at the top in the way of accidents. Now, I'm curious as to why that number is so high.
I don't, now that chart that I showed was for the world, not for our country. So I don't, John, do you know what percentage we rely on coal today in this country?
The figures I have are also for the world. So I don't know.
John Paul, do you know that one?
We're about 50% coal.
I was going to say 49, but yeah, I was going to say something like that. So that's just what we depend on. I mean, we have been using coal for a long time, and the dilemma that I see is we need this nuclear source because you can't just replace it easily, and you certainly can't replace it by looking just to the wind and solar and all the rest of that. Not at present in any way. Now solar is increasing in efficiency in very profound ways, but it's nowhere near. Again, I'm not the expert on this kind of stuff, but it doesn't seem to me to be anywhere near at present producing the amounts of energy that we're going to require to maintain the life that we have. So if you want to maintain your present lifestyle for the immediate future, I do not see an alternative to nuclear, because you can't, if you just shut it down, you're in a world of hurt. And you're going to be more and more reliant on coal, which we're all not wanting to do for climate change. So you can see the problems that we have with this. But Jack, I don't know other than that, that's how much it is.
All right, great. I know this is I know these topics, a lot of people might have questions they want or quick comments they want to jump in and say. So if you want to raise your hand or send a comment about that, I'm happy to. I saw John Paul, you raised your hand, I think about something we were just currently talking about. If you want to add in just another quick comment before we move on to the next question.
I'll wait some.
Okay.
I've asked
I do
John,
have things to say about the prospects of nuclear power as we go forward. As
Yeah.
Fred and I have discussed, there's a company called NuScale, N-U capital S-C-A-L-E, that has already gotten NRC approval for design for distributed nuclear. Basically, these are built modules of about 60 megawatts each, and they can be put together with about as many as 12 of these things, and they'd approach the capacity of a large steam plant. And that technology is about to be introduced, what do you call it, into the United States. It'd be a more distributed model. In other words, you probably see instead of very large plants, start out with some smaller modules that will require some changes in the grid, but at least it would fit into the way the grid actually works today. Solar and wind are they're a challenge to the grid. They're considered by the power industry as non-dispatchable energy. And that's because it can't be depended on minute by minute when you need it. A cloud coming across to your area could cause significant problems in the power industry when you're talking about generating something that has to be at 60 cycles a second.
yeah, I think that is the challenge for alternative sources of energy, that they just, at present, I keep saying at present, they can't step up and produce in amounts that are going to be needed if you get rid of major segments like coal and nuclear. And so, you know, I know that the solar people get really upset if you start talking about solar and using data about solar from anything more than 5 years ago, because they say it is so different now than it was. They've made some really great strides. And of course, all of us want to encourage the production of solar energy. Nobody wants to prevent them from that. But at any rate, go ahead, Lance, or whoever's doing this. Yeah.
All right. So next in the list, we have a comment from Richard Petway. Where is that comment? Sorry, I'm scrolling for it.
When 3 Mile Island, can you hear me? When
Yeah.
3 Mile Island occurred, as a financial economist, we tend to believe that when information arrives in the stock market, prices change if there is an economic effect. So I wanted to see if the 3 Mile Island accident affected electric utility stock returns. So I conducted a study based upon a Babcock-Wilcox design plant, a nuclear plant. And the Babcock-Wilcox was the design that was used at 3 Mile Island. It was also Babcock-Wilcox design at Fukushima. So there is, this is a company that produces a design that seemed to be popular at the time. And so I tracked every public utility, electric, that used nuclear power plants, those that did not have a Babcock-Wilcox plant, and those that did. So the empirical data resulted in the following study. Those particular plants, those particular companies which employed a Babcock-Wilcox plant for nuclear energy lost significant values in their equity stock compared to those that did not. This was a good result for financial economics, adjusting the risk of this plant design almost immediately after the 3 Mile Island plant, and continued for some time. So the industry or the utilities stockholders were charged for that particular added risk associated with that particular plant design. And it is interesting that Fukushima, which occurred maybe 20 years after the 3 Mile Island or so, was the same exact design as employed by Babcock-Wilcox plant that stores the rods, the spent rods, on the 3rd floor of the reactor building. That's a Babcock-Wilcox design at Fukushima. So it seems that it affected the shareholders, but not necessarily Babcock-Wilcox, because that design was continued without any changes whatsoever, and affecting the economic prices of the shareholders. That's my comment. So the economy is charging for or increasing the risk associated with those plants that did have that particular design of a nuclear plant. That's all my comment.
Great, thank you.
I yield the floor.
Next up on the list are the burns.
Yeah, 2 quicker comments. One, Fred, is that I don't think you mentioned the fact that if you're worried about tritium release, it turns out that a coal plant releases a whole lot more tritium than a nuclear plant. So in that sense, it's inherently safer. I think the other bigger issue that you didn't comment on, as far as I know, was that one of the big problems, and Richard alluded to this, is the storage of the spent fuel rods, and the problem that they represent, since they remain radioactive for a very long time. And it's my understanding that more modern design has addressed this issue. You have any comments on that?
I don't. John Paul, do you know anything about that storage question? I mean, I know that's a big challenge.
Not to my knowledge, Fred. I do know all the FPL sites that I'm familiar with. They're just in cooling canals. What do you call it? You drive by them every time you go to the plant. So,
yeah, Ken, I know. I'm well aware that I didn't deal with that, and I didn't get around. I didn't have time to deal with that, and to do so, I would have had to do some research that I haven't done. So I don't know the answer to your question. I'm fully aware
know that
it's a challenge.
I do know that, for a long time they were trying to convince the folks in Utah to store, move all this stuff across the country to some caverns over there. But of course, those folks objected to that, as well as every state in between that had to transport it across their borders.
Right, right. No, it's a big challenge. None of these options are without their challenges, that's for sure. The question is, how do we balance them rationally?
I thought it was Nevada, not Utah.
Yucca Flats, isn't that it? What you're talking about?
Yeah.
All right,
You know, I
great.
think there's no question that if you want to find an unsafe place, an unsafe way to protect spent nuclear fuel, we've got it right now. Because it should all be collected and put away. But since any place that you ask to propose to save it, it's in somebody's backyard, right? So even if it's in Nevada, where the backyard is hundreds of miles away. Yeah, but we're definitely not saving that safely.
Great, thank you for those questions. They actually brought up the next one too, which was a chat from Bob Bernstein, but that was exactly what you asked. Did you have another one? I'm sorry, I know you mentioned you had two. I don't know if that covered them both.
No, it was about the storage of spent nuclear fuel, and we have about 100,000 tons in the U.S., and I guess it's just sitting around now. Some of my question had been about the controversy around Yucca Mountain.
Just a quick comment. At the present time, the spent rods are stored in the plant containment building of the plant. So they just move them to a different location, a different water pool, if you will. Sometimes the Babcock-Wilcox plant, they're on the third floor of the nuclear protected building, but that raises a specter is when you get a meltdown in the core. That's in the containment building, and it could expose more rods on the third floor of that building. But usually when the core breaks, it goes down, not up, because it's heavy. It boils, it goes out the bottom into the containment building, and then usually goes through the floor to the basement.
To China, that's the China syndrome, right? That's where we're supposed to sink all the way to China.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a list of people to hit. I did see though, just because while we're on this topic, I want to make sure we hit it. But if you kind of keep it a little short, John Paul, I saw you had a reaction to this comment. Do you have something to say, or should I keep moving on to the next person? I just wanted to make sure because you seem to have a
not really. But I was just commenting that most of the utilities, the spent fuel rods, are actually in cooling canals. And I saw I can't remember what the figure was, but if you put all the stuff together that is out there in those canals out there, it's not very much. What do you got? Somebody, I forget what the figure was, but they said if in a large building, it might fill the first 2 or 3 floors. I think they used the Empire State Building at the time. They said it would fill the first 2 or 3 floors of the Empire State Building. So it's not a lot of material, but of course it's all very dangerous.
Yeah, that's a big challenge for the nuclear industry, is the question of waste.
Okay, we have a bunch of people and it's 10:51, so I'm just going to start going through these. Up next, we have Rick Gold, who has their hand raised.
Thanks so much. From 99 to 2003, I was overseeing U.S. government assistance for development to Ukraine. And as part of that, I was involved in international cooperation to deal with the effects of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, including officially closing it down, but particularly creating a cement cover over the whole nuclear plant to withdraw to deal with the effects. And so I think that, Fred, you perhaps underestimated some of the impacts. And I wanted to quote from a couple paragraphs from the International Atomic Energy Agency report, final report on the Chernobyl situation. It says, the definitive numbers compiled in the Chernobyl report are sobering. The 50 emergency rescue workers who died from acute radiation syndrome and related illnesses, the 4,000 children and adolescents who contracted thyroid cancer, 9 of whom also died, the hundreds of thousands of hectares of cropland, forest, rivers, and urban centers that were contaminated by environment fallout. The situation was made worse by conflicting information and vast exaggerations in press, reporting, for example, fatalities in the tens or hundreds of thousands. The psychological and social impacts were also devastating. 100,000 people were evacuated, 350,000 evacuees in total. There were depression, stress, severe economic hardship, poverty, mental health, and lifestyle diseases. So all of those issues need to be taken into account when you're dealing with regulation, oversight, and particularly this is important in places like Ukraine, where the government was not accountable. The Soviet Union government was not accountable to the people. And, you know, you look at what happened with the Boeing 737 MAX here in the US, and you wonder, you know, is our government interested and capable of providing the oversight necessary to deal with the nuclear power industry?
Good comments.
This folds actually really well into what was about to come next, which is a chat from Roy Weiner, which is there a rationale for a single central international regulatory body to optimize safety of an expanded nuclear energy resource? So those two fold really well together if there are comments about those.
Well, it would be nice if we had such a thing. It's very difficult to get international cooperation on this. For example, under the Trump administration, a lot of the regulations that were governing the nuclear industries were removed. Now we'll see what Biden does about that. But it has been a highly regulated industry. That's one of the reasons why they haven't been building any new plants. And so, you know, again, you have two-sided challenges, and international cooperation is very difficult where nuclear matters are concerned, because the rich nations, and especially the United States, is inherently not trusted. We've got everything, right? And so we're going to do something to that international agency that will skew things in our direction. So it's really hard to do. You know what I'd like to focus on, and I don't know, we probably don't have time to do it today, but we can assess the problems, and we know the problems are enormous, right? The biggest problem we have is, how do we provide energy? How do we divide up the different industries? How do we do that? How do we supply the energy? If we, you know, when it comes right down to it, I don't see an option of getting rid of nuclear. So how then do we proceed? Excuse me, that's the challenge we have. Assessing, I mean, we're aware of the dangers. I think all of us would be willing to admit that nuclear is like other industries, but it may be singularly difficult in terms of the dangers that it presents, certainly psychologically. But what do we do in the face of that? All right, I'll stop.
All right, great. Up next, we have a chat from Keith Berg. They have a question on Wirt's comment that was cited.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm having trouble. I had to switch to my phone because the terrible connection problems I'm having on the internet. I think I will forego my question and maybe talk to Fred some other time about it. So I'll let somebody else go on who has something more maybe directly relevant.
Sure. Thank you for that. So up next then is Bill Rossi, who has their hand raised.
Thank you very much. Actually, what I wanted to mention follows very closely with the question that our presenter just leveled. What are we going to do on a going forward basis? I guess it was months ago. I took an ILR course that was hosted by, it was on China, hosted by Jerry Kirkpatrick. And in this course, we explored where China is now and what their strategy is and where they're going to be in the years ahead in a number of issues. One of which was providing electricity to their population. They have to do that, okay? And our presenter indicated that China currently has the most coal-fired plants of anyone. What China is, China's strategy is underpinned by the notion that it has to provide electricity to its population. Okay? And it wants to get away from coal-fired plants. Okay? But their plan is to evolve over 50 years. Okay? They are currently building more coal-fired plants, but their plan is to switch to nuclear, hydro, and let's see, what was the third one? Nuclear, hydro, and solar. But that's going to take 50 years to evolve. And in the early part of those 50 years, they are going to continue building more coal-fired plants, because underpinning all this is the requirement that they provide electricity to their population. So they are going to be building a lot of nuclear plants over the coming years, a lot. Okay? And granted, they may be on the other side of the planet from where we're sitting now, but catastrophes of the type that we've talked about here, with so many nuclear plants, could have an effect on a worldwide basis. I would suggest that we look at this in terms of the way China is, that we have to provide electricity to our population, as does Europe, as does Russia, as does the Far East, ex-China. And so the only way to do that is to pursue all things clean energy, including nuclear. I don't think we have an option. And I recognize that there's a risk of accidents occurring. They've happened. They're probably going to occur again. But we have to have electricity. And I don't think we have an option other than to pursue nuclear, as well as wind and solar, and perhaps even hydro here. Thanks.
If there are no comments about that, up next we have Dick Suter, who has their hand raised.
Yeah, I want to get back to this question of how we're going to supply electricity in the U.S. I think Fred's concern about relying on nuclear power is misplaced, because there's clearly the supply, the increase in supply of electricity in the U.S. has been mainly three things. Well, one, at least half of the extended capacity over the last year or two has been in natural gas-fired plants. And the other half, I think, is more or less a combination of wind and solar. And we have a huge supply or reserves of natural gas. There's no reason that we cannot supply our electricity needs by expanding natural gas fired plants. And clearly wind and solar are going to grow considerably over the next 20, 30 years. And we simply don't need nuclear. And besides that, the cost per kilowatt hour of producing electricity from nuclear plants, from new nuclear plants, is considerably higher than the cost of producing it with natural gas, wind, and solar. So I really don't see that there's really any future in the U.S. for building new nuclear plants, and we simply don't need it.
The one thing, Dick, that I mean, if you're correct and we are able to, that's wonderful. I mean, I'm not wedded to nuclear power. I don't see an alternative myself, but the one downside to what you're proposing does affect the climate. In other words, nuclear has a major problem with waste. Natural gas contributes to climate change. So, increasing that is increasing our problems on another front. So there's no, you move this around, you get something else move. It's one of those complicated things, but we'll figure it out some way or another. Let's hope optimally.
Yeah, well, that's true. There is carbon dioxide emitted by burning natural gas,
Yeah.
but it's considerably less than it is with coal, for example. And if you look into the far future, like 20, 30 years, natural gas is going to be the big contributor for at least the next few years, but eventually that's going to phase down, and wind and solar are going to become much more important. And I don't see any room there for nuclear ever being a major additional contributor of electricity in the U.S.
In reference to this, Roy Weiner has just sent a chat saying, is this argument universally accepted or largely accepted? This analysis that Dick Suter just provided.
I have major questions. My biggest question is the capacity of wind and solar to step up to produce the amounts that are needed. I don't see that happening. I don't see it happening. There may be ways to explain how that can happen, but right now they're not anywhere close. And of course, they would have to do massive improvements.
Yeah,
it's a dilemma. That's all. I mean, I'd love to solve the problem any way we can.
Fred, part of that is going to require some advances in battery technology in order to make that happen.
Yeah, and that's happening. I mean, I think that's happening, and the new solar technology is really improved majorly. So, yeah, I mean, maybe. Let's hope.
Yeah.
You're going to have it. It would to go to pure solar would be a major change in the grid architecture. It would take having to have a lot of battery, and just for a second, think about nighttime falling across the country or early morning during the day. You'd have to have a lot more facilities to transport the power from where you have it stored to where you need it. So the solar is coming. It's gonna need a large battery capacity, which is not here today. I'm sorry, there are some promising aspects of it, but it's not here today, and it's going to take a while before we get there.
Yeah, could I say that sort of looking at the way the power supply is going to expand in the future? Sure, all of these things are changing and improving battery capacity. The cost of generating electricity by natural gas has decreased considerably, and may again in the future. The cost of solar is going to be continued to decline. The cost of wind powered is going to continue to decline. All of these things are changing over time. And if you ask the question of how is our electricity going to be supplied, it's not a question of central planning. It's the way the markets operate. And the way it looks now, it's going to be natural gas. Then later, wind is going to continue to expand. Solar is going to continue to expand. There will be some solar. I mean, some nuclear. What we have now, but I think it's very unlikely that any utility company is going to build new nuclear capacity in the U.S. I just don't see it. But it all depends on the market. It's not a question of central planning. It's how the markets evolve.
On the topic of the utilities and the businesses who do it, iPhone. So the next chat was sent. It just says iPhone. So if you hear me say this, it sounds familiar. Feel free to unmute and add any more comments. But they say that their concerns are with management. Duke has made terrible decisions at Crystal River in trying to save money. Also, a number of our sites are aging. And lastly, U.S. does not have a solution to managing waste. Does anyone have a comment on that? Just another perspective to think about from iPhone.
Thank you for repeating that.
Up next, we have another chat, and this one is from Burton Bennett, who says, we must consider the issue of risk perception when we consider the role that nuclear energy could play in our energy future.
Thank you. It's been an interesting discussion. I agree with our presenter, Fred. The advantages for nuclear power are sort of overwhelming, but the waste management and the liability expenses, I think, could be managed if we had a mind to it. But I wanted to mention the risk perception issue, which is a difficult one. My first job was with the Atomic Energy Commission in New York, and we would take calls from the public who had worries about radiation. And I received a call from a lady in New Jersey who lived near the Forked River nuclear plant in southern New Jersey. And she had decided she was going to move to Colorado because she wanted to get away as far away from that reactor as possible. Well, in reality, the radiation exposures from the reactor were minimal. And in addition, for moving from sea level to high altitude in the mountains of Colorado, her cosmic ray exposures would be doubled, if not tripled. And the sandy soil around that nuclear plant in New Jersey was hardly any natural radiation exposure, whereas the granite and limestone in Colorado was a very high natural radiation. But she was determined to move anyway to Colorado. So my take was that people are not so concerned about natural radiation. It's man-made, it must not be so harmful, but they are concerned about man-made radiation from the reactor. And this risk perception issue is a difficult one to address.
Great.
I can make a comment about the Fukushima plant. They blocked off a considerable area and closed it down. Nobody lives there, but they're slowly reducing the restrictions. So people are trying to move back into some of the safer zones now, and they plan to try to reoccupy the plant if the radiation remains at a low level. So they're actually, my impression is that people are not moving back to the plant in Russia, Chernobyl, but they're right now developing plans to move some of the people back into the Fukushima area in Japan.
Great, thank you. Up next, we have a hand raised by Larry Lowenthal.
Okay, two quick things. One, there is a index fund that invests only in the shares of solar power companies. So I urge you all to buy that immediately. So I already did. Secondly, a few years ago, I was reading obituaries, an odd habit, when I was in South Florida, and there was a fellow that had passed away in Broward, and he was a mathematician. And I noticed that he had been employed by the Manhattan Project. I thought, well, what do they want him for? And his task was to evaluate, to determine, if he could, whether the fission would end with the when the fuel was used up, nuclear fuel, or would it continue unchecked and destroy the Earth in a flash of nuclear sun-like flame. He determined that the explosions, the fission would end with the dissipation of the fuel, and they went ahead relieved, and then they felt free to conduct the first experiment at Alamogordo. That's it. That's what one of the fears they were facing. Will we destroy the Earth with this first test?
Thank you. Up next, we have a hand raised by Izzy Shiver.
Yeah, a couple of comments, and then one is we're making some assumptions that we don't really know what's true. One is hopefully from my standpoint that maybe my grandchildren will be willing to live in a house that I grew up in instead of the one I live in now. And the energy requirement would be less. The other is we don't, and working on the roof. The other is we don't know what the world population will be. But the last one is, when we talk about China, we and other industrial nations have used coal and polluted the earth already. Why can't China do what we did, or do we have to help China avoid that?
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Up next, we have the Burns with a raised hand.
Yes, I think that one of the interesting numbers, if I remember correctly, excuse me, for you mentioned that France is about 70% nuclear. If I remember correctly, Germany was about 30%. Angela Merkel committed to getting it down to zero and by 20 years or something. It's not at all clear, even though she's a physicist by background, that she had really thought the numbers through very well. And I've heard no follow-up on that political announcement. it's my understanding that right now, nobody is going to build a coal-powered plant in the United States. There's no interest in doing it. So I don't worry about that so much. I think the issue with the nuclear plants is that the regulatory issues are so complex that enormously increases the price of construction of a nuclear plant. And the question of whether that's justified, of course, is up in the air. But I think that the arguments on both sides, from Dick and from you, Fred, simply remind me that in 1900, nobody saw jet flight. I mean, things are going to happen in the next few years that truly we can't imagine unless we're Jules Verne equivalent. So, you know, I think the notion that this can't happen or won't happen, you should view that with an open mind.
I agree with that. You know, it would be wonderful if we could perfect fusion reactors. We haven't talked about that at all. They are being investigated. They would solve all our problems because there's so much hydrogen available that it would be just a windfall. We wouldn't have any of these other problems. And they're nuclear, but they are not, you know, if anything goes wrong in a fusion reactor, it shuts down. That's all, the reaction stops. It's not dangerous for explosions or anything like that. So it would be inherently more safe, but it is nowhere near the break point on developing that.
Fred's comment, in the US, in the last 10 years, the emissions from the power industry have continually come down for the last 10 years. And that's because they have moved from coal. They've switched positions from 50 to 30 between coal and the gas. The gas is, of course, 1/2 the footprint, carbon footprint of coal. And so the transition to gas has actually driven down the emissions. As to China, as Bill Rossi pointed out, they are building 1,100 new coal plants because they just need that for their, for their generation. They don't see any short-term way of avoiding that. So they are not, according to the climate accord, they don't peak until 2035 in their emissions. As to Germany, interestingly enough, Germany decided they were going to close down all their nuke plants, but at the same time, they're helping building a gas line coming from Russia. So they'll be increasing their fossil footprint in that country. So we got a world that's kind of has a lot of different directions at one time.
Yeah.
Up next, we have a hand raised by Eli Glazer.
Okay, just two comments. I think the elephant in the room is, do we have the ability to elect a government that believes in science? I'm beginning to question that. I hope we're moving in that direction. But the other thing I want to observe is I get a copy or every day or every other day of a newsletter from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And in today's email, they question the current plan here in the US to invest $100 billion in AI managed drone delivery weapons. If that doesn't scare us, I don't think nothing will.
Thank you. Up next, we have a chat from Bob Bernstein. I'm finding the chat. There it is. Is the big grid necessary, or can electric generation be distributed, for example, by neighborhood fuel cells?
I'm not the person to answer that one.
I'm seeing some head shakes. I'm seeing some head nods. I don't know if anyone's really got the answer to this based off of what I'm seeing from everyone in on their screen.
The assumption seems to be that we'll have big generating plants and then we'll have to distribute that energy. If we could distribute the production of the energy, then we wouldn't need as big a grid. That's the basis of my question, and whether anybody has any input. I think John Paul might.
Well, again, you can look towards that new scale, which is talking about smaller modules, 60 megawatts or something like that. And again, certainly you have, at some point, you have to connect all those grids though. Because you're never going to have enough in any one place to completely satisfy your population, all your population at the same time. So you need a grid no matter what you do.
Thank you.
A couple of comments on that, just briefly, is the development of a energy wall battery system by Tesla is becoming quite popular for home generation or home backup power. As you remember, if you walk outside, you see Regeneron, which are these units that if we get a power shortage here at Okamak, we've got backup power installed. We were required to buy a backup power system because of our health units, and that has been done here. We also are getting solar power here at Okamak on our roof as the roof is being redone, and as the roof is being finished, there will be solar panels all over our roof here at Okamak, reducing our very large bill for electricity. One more comment I'd like to make about to John Paul's comment about China. China has abundant coal. It unfortunately is not a clean coal, or even close to reduced carbon coal, and they want to use it up. They also have done very effective with the Yangtze River electrical power system and some nuclear. But as John Paul alluded to, it's thought that the economic stability of China, since they're growing at a faster rate than any other country in the world, they need to continue coal and would like to use it all up first. To my knowledge, there are no wind systems, but they could benefit from some wind systems in China, especially in the mountains.
Great, thank you. Up next, we have 2 more questions, and then we will call it there because it will be 11:30. But the next one is from Pat H, which is, what is the cost to the environment of producing / disposing of batteries?
Good question.
I don't know if anyone's got even an answer to this one, but it's something to think on at least.
We've got a similar issue with the solar panels.
And then the very last person is going to be Jack, who has their hand raised.
Just a couple comments. Back to the gentleman who talked to the lady who moved to Colorado. We don't worry about threats if we don't know what the threats are. For example, the luminous part of our watch dials are emitting some radiation. Here in Gainesville, the soil composition is such that there's an issue with radon. It accumulates in the homes unless there's some way to vent it out. There are ways to remediate that. And those cannot be, I mean, they're not very costly, but if you're not aware of it, you're not eliminating the threat. So many regions, because of the soil, have uranium elements in it. We are all exposed all the time if you live in those areas. That's it.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for all of your questions and submitting in the chat and raising your hand. And thank you.
It was a good discussion, folks.
Yeah, I would just like to say a few more words. First of all, to thank all the viewers. We had to master this new Zoom technology, but I think it was worth the effort. I'm waiting for the time when our speakers can come and sit in our auditorium at Oak Hammock and we can have lunch discussions with them. But I think that's going to be a while off yet. But as always, you viewers have listened and asked great questions, and some of you brought fresh insights. I think that this is either the 9th or 10th time that the ILR has had the pleasure of being informed by a lecture from Fred Gregory. I've lost track. So Fred, I do want to thank you very much for another great series. And you know that you have a standing invitation to come back anytime and talk about any subject that interests you, because we know that we will be interested and informed as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you folks all for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fred.